Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be wrapping up with Mitchel and Bonnie's case. So here's your warning. If you haven't already listened to part 1, hit pause and go back and listen to that one first. Because now it's part 2 of the disappearance of Mitchel Weiser and Bonita Bickwit. Now, we're going to pick up just about where we left off, with the introduction of Eric Greenburg's reporting, as well as the admission by authorities that they made numerous mistakes in the past in regards to this investigation. So, obviously, authorities are admitting the faults of the investigation at this point, but it doesn't make any of it better, doesn't fix any of the problems that came from the past, and they'd have to do some serious police work to try and fix these mistakes, or honestly, at the very least, show they're trying, right? The article continues and lays out some huge blunders of law enforcement along the way, including not inputting the missing teens' information in the FBI database at the time for missing individuals. But the biggest and worst offense, in my opinion, is what was just stated in that last quote I read for you at the end of last week's episode. And that's that the original case file was lost. But what makes it even worse is that it contained the only copy of Mitchel and Bonnie's dental records.
You gotta be shitting me.
How ridiculous.
The only copy, though? Like, you can't go back to an old dentist to get another copy?
Well, you have to think now.
I mean, we're talking 30 years.
Yes. So is that guy or girl, whoever the dentist might have been, are they still around?
Jesus.
Are they still practicing? What do you do in that instance? You fucking lost it? What
That's
do you mean
crazy.
you lost it? So, as I was all fired up while I was researching this, I very conveniently stumbled across somebody's comment on Web Sleuths. And it makes me want to bring up something that we've talked about recently and I think is really important and I want to see more of in this true crime world, but that's citizen detectives. So to go back to the whole file situation, I don't know if lost means lost, and this is exactly what this person on Web Sleuths had to say. Was it destroyed? Is it somewhere else? Who knows? So this guy stated, quote, "Lost doesn't always mean destroyed or misplaced. In this day and age, a lost file is quite often a file whose records have been neither digitized nor indexed in a central database. In such cases, paper files could probably be found in some obscure repository where fetching them is comparatively time-consuming, therefore costly, and that wouldn't be done unless very compelling evidence surfaces. In many institutions, including law enforcement agencies, files that aren't readily available through the regular channels are often considered lost, even though they exist in archives. A private investigator would probably be able to locate the missing files if someone is willing to pay for it." End quote.
Especially in a large agency like NYPD or maybe one of these others that were involved.
Yep.
But yes, I totally agree. Lost does not mean destroyed. It means, hey, put the work in and find it. Because it's around here somewhere.
Yeah, so I have seen here and there the word destroyed in this case. I have also seen the word lost used very frequently. So I don't know which is more accurate. Were they accidentally destroyed? I don't know how the fuck you could do that. But at the end of the day, what I think is you bring in a citizen detective. I am sure there are people in this world that would volunteer their time for not one fucking penny to go through the archives and find that for this case.
Absolutely.
I'll sign up right now. I will do it.
All right, well, you got to get up to New York now, so get on the bus.
I would do it. I would absolutely do it.
So I think where you say that destroyed and lost have been brought up, perhaps the dental records from the doctor's office were destroyed. And the file
with them
on this investigation is lost.
That could make sense, yeah.
Because if you think 30 years have passed, I don't know what the regulation was back in the day where how long do you keep a patient's information? You may
Yeah,
have
I
to keep
don't
it
know.
for 10 years. You may have to keep it for 20. And then after that, what do? You destroy it.
Yeah.
You shred it, you burn it, you do whatever. But with police documentation, if it's an active and open investigation, I doubt you're throwing it in a shred bin.
No, I wouldn't think so.
It's probably lost, and it's probably in an area where it shouldn't be.
There are ways to find it, because how many Jane and John Does could there be across this country that are not identified that could match their description that you now have no way
And who knows, you might have a
testing.
John and a Jane Doe found in the same location,
Exactly.
which could even narrow it down even better, because if these two were in love and they were always together,
Yep.
who knows, they might be found together.
But yeah, like how hard would it be to potentially use genealogical DNA to maybe get something from a sibling and test? And I mean, that's probably more expensive. So
I think everything comes down to money,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Well,
If
I
you're a
am offering
millionaire,
up my
you'll-
services to the NYPD or the Sullivan County PD. And if you need someone to dig through your freaking archives, I will do it.
I applaud you for wanting to do that, because there's a lot of spiders and cobwebs in there, I'm sure.
I'll just go in one of those,
Hazmat suits.
yeah, with like what's the thing with the flies that you put on your head? The net?
The beekeeping suit.
Yeah, that with my gloves, I'll be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, citizen detectives, it's just, I feel like that's a big thing. And
If it's an NYPD case, and if this stuff was lost from NYPD,
yeah,
they are far overwhelmed with cases right now that they are not going to be able to
Go
dedicate
back
enough
to-
resources to go back to these other older cases
Yep.
without money, without somebody with power and influence coming forward and forcing them to do so. So back to what you said about citizen detectives, these are people willing to donate their time. There needs to be something worked out there. And I know we've said it before, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but
Yeah.
bring in people that are willing to offer you their time and effort to hopefully find something.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll get off our citizen detective soapbox for now. So this reporter, Eric Greenburg, he didn't hold back in his reporting. His article is like literally 9 pages long, and you can find the entire thing on the official Mitchell and Bonnie website, which I will have linked in the show notes. But this guy even went on to interview frickin' John Walsh for his piece. Like, he just went and just wanted opinions from everyone and just laid it all out there. And it was like, finally, 25 years later, like, this is what this case needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And John Walsh, nice name drop.
Yeah, absolutely. Overall, it seems like all the information in this article and the new push in the media was putting pressure on authorities to get more involved in the case at this point. I don't know if it was Greenburg per se that pushed them to look into the case more, or if they were already doing it before, kind of on the DL, but either way, between 1998 and 2000, this case is getting the publicity it finally deserved, and also finally in 2000, the state attorney general got involved as well. All of this was long past overdue, but at least it was finally happening.
It was probably Greenberg's work on the case, bringing all of this information to light, and then political pressure brought onto the police department to say, hey, who's this Greenburg guy talking about this case? It's time to put some effort in.
Yeah, definitely. And over like this span of time, there were other officers who had gotten involved, and the case did seem to be like bounced around a little bit between different detectives. And again, this was like another confusing aspect of it, is how long was this individual assigned to the case? Was it once this media outlet was, circulating a little bit more about the case? Or was it something that they were assigned way earlier, and by the time that the media was doing it, now it's like, oh shit, like, let me show what I've done, Okay, so now I'm about to bombard you with a lot of information, and a bunch of which came from Eric Greenburg's investigation into the missing teens, the MSNBC segment done on the case, as well as information I found on a 48 Hours proposal that I believe may have been written by Mitchell's sister, along with a lot of other reporting on the case around this time. Like I mentioned, there was a lot more publicity now. Most of this information came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. There's no specific order because, like I mentioned earlier on, the lack of reporting and piecemealing of little tidbits in this case was just hard to put together chronologically. But let's start with what I know took place in 2000. In June of 2000, there was a class reunion for the class of 1975, which I believe would have been Bonnie's graduation year. It was the 25-year reunion for John Dewey High School, and during the reunion, the alumni got together to plant a tree in Mitchell and Bonnie's name. One classmate told the Daily News, quote, "The tree ceremony was a dedication, not a memorial, because nobody knows if they're alive or dead," end quote. Something else interesting that came out around this time that, again, is going to be something that might make you believe the couple ran away, but I promise your opinion on that may certainly change as we keep going. But Bonnie and Mitchel had supposedly also exchanged wedding rings the summer before they went missing, even though they hadn't actually gotten married, but I think it may have been like a promise of sorts.
That's what I was going to say. Are you talking a wedding ring or a promise ring?
Every which way I've seen this reported is that it was wedding rings.
All right.
Another big piece of information that was discussed in the MSNBC segment on this case that previously, like back when it happened, had given the families some hope that Bonnie and Mitchel might still be alive was that apparently years prior, sometime between roughly 1987 and 1989, I can't quite pin down the exact year, but Mitchel's parents received a call, and it was an operator asking if they'd accept charges on a collect call from someone who identified themselves as Bonnie.
So that goes back to the charge to
Bonita's family.
From Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so even more so now, we have Bonnie's family getting a collect call charge, essentially.
Back in the day, yeah.
Back in the day from Indiana, and now you have another one from another location, also from Bonnie.
Supposedly.
Supposedly, right. So if an operator is asking if you accept the charges, that is what I would believe is a collect call.
Yeah.
Tom, we had a baby, eats a boy.
Yes, exactly.
Do you remember that commercial?
I do remember that commercial. Mitchel's sister stated, quote, "He got all excited and said yes, but the operator told him, 'I'm sorry,' she hung up," end quote.
That's weird.
Yeah. Do you think it was her?
I mean, I don't know. It could have been her, but if we're talking back in like 87 and 89, what are the odds that somebody outside of the general area of like New York would have known about this case, would have been able to call the family's phone number, say they are Bonita or Bonnie? That's another thing to think about. Did they say they were Bonnie or Bonita?
Bonnie.
Okay, so Bonnie. I don't know. I'm 49% one way, 51% the other way. I feel like I've said that multiple times over the past few cases.
What did I tell you about ping pong? And this is the ping pong case of the century, it feels like.
It's quite the volley.
Yes, good way to put it. So it was the Weiser family that had received the call from Bonnie, not Bonnie's family that received the call from Bonnie. So I thought that was interesting too.
Still, but for it to be Bonnie and not Bonita,
yeah.
Who knows how it was reported in other news outlets?
Yeah.
It was probably like,
Well, it was definitely her saying Bonnie because Mitchel's sister was interviewed.
What I was going for was that if it was reported, Bonita in a news outlet, how would she know to say Bonnie? Or how would this person know to say Bonnie?
It was everywhere.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Never
Bonita,
mind.
asterisk, whatever, quotes, yeah.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
So the Weiser family never received another call like this from anyone identifying themselves as Bonnie, but they did keep their information in the Brooklyn phone book, so in case Mitchel or Bonnie ever surfaced again or wanted to talk to their families again, if they had just run away, that they would be able to get in touch with them later. And what I thought was really awesome, too, is that the Weisers had actually moved across the country to, I believe, Arizona at some point, and the Brooklyn phone book people, like whoever ran it, they actually let them keep their Arizona info in the phone book just in case. That kind of restored my faith in humanity a little bit for them to be like, no, you don't live here, you don't have New York or Brooklyn information, but we'll let you keep it in this phone book because of this circumstance that you guys have dealt with.
You always find good people in the least likely of places. Mm-hmm. Very similar to when we were trying to get to Texas.
Yes, this is very true.
And we were running real late, and we were begging people to get in front of them in the lines at the airport.
Thank God for John, guys, because I would have just missed the flight.
I'm like running through. I'm like, please let us get through. We're going to miss our flight. We're going to miss our flight. And so many people said yes. It was like...
Yeah, there was like one person who didn't. And then somebody else was like, no, come here. You cut me instead. And so it was really awesome. Those two girls, if you even know who we were from the Boston airport, and for some odd reason you're listening to this and you let us cut in before you in security, you are my heroes of life. Thank you. You're my favorite people ever because that was amazing.
Yeah, so I mean, in the least likely of places, you find the good in humanity because you always have like a negative outlook on things. You're always easily annoyed. But then when you really need help, true colors come through. And I think Luke Bryan said it best when he said, I believe most people are good.
I fucking hate that song. I fucking hate that song. But I think that with this case anyway, it's a lot of shitty situation after shitty situation. You're looking at the cops and how they're not doing anything. You're looking at the first psychic I told you about that seemed to be taking advantage, and all just these not nice people throughout. And just this one little thing, I was like, oh, you nice people, you let them keep their stuff in there even though they didn't live in the state anymore. Like, that's so nice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just, why I thought that was nice.
Heartwarming,
yes. Okay, so now there are a couple of things I want to tell you that I think are reasons that you might start to think maybe they didn't run away, and maybe it throws a wrench into the theory of them leaving of their own accord a little bit. So we had talked about this a little bit before, and it was discovered that both Mitchel and Bonnie's parents confirmed that they'd each left paychecks behind that weren't cashed yet. I know, John, you said earlier that that wasn't like a total make you switch your belief type thing, but now knowing that Mitchel also left money behind, and he had only had $25 with him, and he essentially declined taking additional money from his mom. I mean, why would he leave all this money on the table if he wanted to just vanish?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that if he knew what was coming, or if he had planned to run away with Bonnie, that he would have left behind any funds that he could have, taken along with him.
Exactly. I mean, if you're trying to start this new life and you already spent $25 on a taxi through the same state, you're probably going to need a lot more money to live somewhere else, get an apartment, find somewhere to live. I don't know. Like, you're going to need more than just a handful of money, even more than just $80 that we know Bonnie had taken.
Yeah, unless when he left, his assumption was that they were going to Summer Jam.
And then that changed.
And it changed once he got with Bonnie and she vented her frustrations about what she was going through, and then it could have morphed into whatever potentially happened.
Yeah, maybe. Well, another thing is that Bonnie's father had apparently been sick prior to her disappearance. According to the Charlie Project's write-up on the case, quote, she was very worried about her father, who was ill and disabled. Her friends at Camp Wellmet said she cried at night when she talked about her father, end quote. And it was reported that her dad actually did end up passing away in 1979, so only 6 years after she had disappeared.
Yeah, that's tough to say that, okay, Bonnie was very unhappy with work and camp, but when she talked about her father and how he was ill, she cried. It's like, it's tough to tear yourself away from a family member or beloved parents to then, run away and never see them again.
Yeah, that's hard if she cared that much. And exactly.
Right. So, I mean, it's not like she left for the summer like her mom had hoped and then came back. She would have still had a few years with her father. It's like left and never returned.
Yeah. Can you imagine that mindset today, though? To say, oh, yeah, they just left for the summer. Like, that's normal? That's so odd to think about. I could never imagine, like, if I had a child and they just went missing, that would never even be a thought that went into my head.
Well, I think nowadays things are too expensive. People aren't as nice as they used to be. Social media, the internet and everything has made people more hostile.
There's tracking on everything, too.
Right, but back in the day, like, you would think that if you went up to a farm, right? This is a weird thought, but if you went up to a farm and said, hey, I'm just traveling through, I'm looking for work, can you help me out? I'll sleep in the barn, help you out, and give you some money or whatever. Back then, it seemed like that would be a more acceptable request.
Yeah.
As opposed to now, it's like, no, like, get out of here. What are you doing?
It's interesting you say that because Riverdale definitely tried to make that a thing.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, Archie and, sorry if I'm spoiling this for anyone, but Archie and Jughead, left town or whatever, and they ended up, staying at some chick's farm and helping her, and it's like the 2010s or whatever. Yeah. It's just funny that you said that, but yeah, that would be more common, I would think, in the 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s, but now today it would be like,
why are you even stepping foot on my property?
Why didn't you apply online? Right,
exactly.
But, okay, so there's still more here. One of Bonnie's friends had also been chatting with her via letter pretty much the entire summer in 1973, and this friend was actually in Europe for the summer, so they were exchanging letters back and forth, and this friend said that Bonnie seemed completely normal. There was no indication that she wanted to run off and never come back. And that was actually the common sentiment amongst all of Mitchel and Bonnie's friends. One friend, Stuart, who I believe is that friend that started the website, said, quote, "They had no inclination to run away. They were both very close to their parents. Mitchell was my best friend at the time, and of course I knew Bonnie. We all hung out together," end quote.
Why wouldn't he have been invited to go to Summer Jam instead of Larry?
I don't know, maybe he wasn't into rock music.
True.
Or maybe his mom told him no. But all right. Now's about the time where I'm going to turn the case on its head a bit. And that has to do with a big lead. Probably the biggest lead that has come in this case, and it came in 2000. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this, John. So, sometime in 2000, a man by the name of Alan Smith, which I do want to say this dude's first name has been spelled probably every which way you can spell Alan in every article I've read on this case. But
S-M-I-T-H.
That's
S-M-Y-T-H.
No, Alan is spelled.
Oh, I thought you were going with Smith.
No, Alan. I said this dude's first name.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
I was thinking Smith.
No, A-L-L-Y-N, A-L-A-N, A-L-L-E-N. I'm like, so what Alan Smith
what
is this guy?
What is common spelling?
I think A-L-L-E-N or A-L-A-N.
Yeah,
A-L-L-Y-N ain't it?
I would have guessed A-L-A-N.
Yeah. All right. Well, so he was from Providence, Rhode Island. And
you got to be shitting me.
I know. And he had seen the MSNBC segment on the case and came forward to authorities with a tip. Now, before we dive into this Alan guy's story, I do just want to mention that he did say that he didn't know Bonnie or Mitchell's names, but from what I can tell, he must have identified the couple based on photos in this segment, and obviously based on his memory. But then there are also other things out there online that discuss how he apparently couldn't fully identify the couple and couldn't remember exactly what they were wearing, or when looking at their photos, say for sure that it was just them. So take what this guy is saying with a grain of salt, but I just want you to be prepared before we dive into his story.
Okay, but he's making a bad name for Rhode Island here.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people make a bad name for Rhode Island. But anyway, Alan Smith stated that he was also traveling to the same concert in Watkins Glen in July of 1973 that Bonnie and Mitchell were hitchhiking towards. He stated that he and the couple had been picked up at some point by a man driving an orange VW bus said to have Pennsylvania license plates. It's unclear if they were picked up together or if Alan was, say, already on the bus when Mitchell and Bonnie were picked up, or vice versa.
Hippies drove VW buses.
You're not wrong. And orange ones.
Very true.
Seriously.
With peace signs on them.
Yeah. But regardless, so Alan sees them on the bus, and apparently he knew that it was them once he saw this segment, because I guess they had been talking about things that pertained to them, specifically like camp and Bonnie's job. And I can only imagine she was probably reeling after abruptly quitting like that, and I would assume was talking to Mitchell about it. The story gets a little more intriguing, though. According to an article with Pix 11, quote, Smith told major case investigator Roy Strever that he'd hitchhiked with the couple after the concert and was riding in an orange Volkswagen bus on a hot day in late July 1973. Smith told the trooper that the VW stopped near the Susquehanna River so everyone inside could cool off, end quote.
Susquehanna River?
Now, two things, John. One, before you ask, I did confirm that the Susquehanna River does travel through New York, because I specifically remembered talking about it in Tracy Crow's episode, which was out of Pennsylvania. But yes, even though we mentioned State Route 97 before in the Delaware River, that's not where this Smith guy is saying he saw the couple. And two, what I found particularly interesting regarding this quote was that he said he'd hitchhiked with them after the concert.
I picked up on that as well.
Yes. So if there's any truth to this story, had they actually made it to Watkins Glen and attended Summer Jam?
Well, you would assume if they already had paid for tickets and they were going to run away, why not stop there? You could meet people. You could find people that may be vagabonds or travelers or whatever. It's a good place to make friends and to find a companion or a couple of them at least.
Yeah, so
to journey onwards.
Yeah, I think you're still definitely thinking of the runaway theory.
Potentially.
Then from there, this is where the story gets a little harder to believe. Mr. Smith says that he watched Bonnie get into the water because obviously they had stopped by the Susquehanna River, and that while she was in there, she was having a hard time staying afloat and the current was just way too strong. So then Mitchell jumped in after her to try and save her, and the two got taken away by the current and, quote, swept away downriver.
What?
Apparently, nobody went in after them to try and save them, and at some point, they all just got back into the bus, and Smith said, oh yeah, I'll call authorities at a payphone nearby.
Really?
Obviously, he wouldn't have been able to do anything on the side of the road at a river, so I can understand trying to find a payphone to make this call.
Well, you can do things on the side of a river. I mean, on the side of the river, there's probably brush. There might be trees. You might be able to find a log or something to throw people.
So at this point, it seems like they were already gone, like they had been swept away and they weren't catching up to them.
Mm-hmm.
So regarding the whole payphone thing, if he was going to go make this call, he said that he would, whatever. It's been reported that an anonymous call about 2 kids swept away in the Susquehanna River was never received. But record keeping back in the early 70s wasn't great. So I do also think it's possible a call could have been made and it wasn't properly recorded. I'm not saying I believe this Smith guy's story, but I'm just playing devil's advocate to say, like, maybe someone didn't record just some random anonymous call that they had, like, no actual proof of something happening.
Yeah, but I mean, I could go either way on this. Like, what a convenient story to tell.
Yes.
To say, oh, they got swept away by the river. But also, like, if somebody called this into, like, a 911 center,
yeah,
there's no way, even back then, if things weren't recorded,
yep,
that this wouldn't have made its way out to authorities and somebody would have been looking for these people.
I guess, yeah, I can see what you're saying. So I will say, not everyone believes this Alan Smith guy's story. It seems like there's a lot of division between what's believed here. Some think it could be accurate. Others think they met with foul play and the story isn't true at all. Others have mentioned that they believe Alan Smith was maybe involved somehow or some way in their deaths or their murders, and that this was his way of maybe coming forward and kind of relieving himself of some semblance of guilt or giving the family some answers.
I don't think so. I think if people are involved and they've gone a long period of time without being, identified or without police hanging around them and questioning them, why come forward and say anything unless you want to be caught or unless you're going to give a confession?
Well, it's interesting you say that because even police have seemed to say, like, at least based on a couple things that I found, not directly from officials themselves, but people discussing things surrounding officials, but it seems like authorities aren't totally on board with his story either. There are conflicting things. There's just weird stuff regarding him.
So I'm not saying that I agree or believe this guy at all. It's a very convenient story to weave to say, oh yeah, we were at this place together and then we thumbed and we hitchhiked together and then they went in the river randomly and the current took them away. Like, that's too convenient to say. But to say that, he's involved and he came forward and wanted to tell a story because he's responsible for their deaths, like, I don't know. I don't think that somebody that's responsible for the deaths that could have killed them or whatever was involved in foul play would come forward and weave this weird story or this very questionable story to police to say this happened. They would have just kept their mouth shut and just never brought any attention to themselves.
Well, the whole point of people thinking that is that they believe he was guilty, like that he felt guilty and that he wanted to...
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. Like, if you're guilty of a crime...
Yeah.
Would you come forward and tell, like, an unbelievable story about what happened, or would you come forward and admit it?
Well, he probably didn't want to go to prison, so...
I don't know, man.
I feel like we've heard about this plenty of times before. Are you pretending like you've never listened to me tell you a case where...
No, I'm saying in this particular case, I just don't believe that if he killed these kids...
Yeah.
That now he's coming forward to police all this time later... and saying, oh yeah, I left the concert with them. We were both in this, orange van or whatever, this VW van, and then they jumped in the river and the river took them away. Why make this very almost unbelievable story up as opposed to just admitting your crime if you're feeling guilty?
Well, why would you admit the crime if you didn't want to go to prison?
Right, that's what I'm saying. You wouldn't even come forward and say anything.
I don't think that's true.
I don't know.
I think people do dumb shit, and I think they try and change the story to, like, alleviate a guilty conscience. He could be eating him alive. He could be an insomniac. He could never sleep again. Like, he could just be feeling absolutely horrible, but he's like, I don't want to ruin my fucking life and go to prison, so I'm just going to tell this probably unbelievable story, but it's going to make me feel better.
Maybe, but you tell this unbelievable story or borderline unbelievable story, and then now police are interested in you. I don't know. I just don't feel like he is involved in their deaths.
You know what? Let me just keep going and tell you a little bit more, so then I'll ask you questions when we're done here.
All
so
right.
I have seen that there was a request that Alan take a polygraph, and that was mentioned like here and there, but I really don't have any clue if he did take one, if he was asked to take one or anything like that. There really isn't a ton on him, surprisingly, but that 48 hours proposal that I mentioned, I believe that Mitchell's sister wrote this because in it does say my brother. So I would assume it's her that wrote this, but I'm not 100% positive. But either way, it was like this long written out proposal to 48 hours to, I believe, ask them to cover Mitchell and Bonnie's case because obviously MSNBC had done a segment and I assume they wanted more media coverage. But within that proposal, it was mentioned and discussed how the two investigators that were working the case specifically with this Alan Smith guy, I guess they got taken off of it and he supposedly was never even polygraphed. So I think there's just like a lot missing here, especially because that proposal was from 22, almost 23 years ago now. And just in general, I don't know where things have progressed in the future. I don't know if the Alan Smith guy is even still alive. I don't know. It's a very common name, and I don't know what spelling is accurate, so just trying to like figure all that out was a little difficult. But
well, I think that goes more in line with my idea of him not being involved. Like, he could have just been this random person.
You think he's some random crackpot that just was like, yeah, let me just tell this random fucking story to be a weirdo?
I think that's more likely, because if there was any inkling that this guy was involved in their deaths, like personally, he was physically involved in their deaths, how would it just fall by the wayside once he was already known to police and speaking with them and interviewed? And how would we not know if a polygraph test took place? It's like, if the light is now shining upon him as potentially being involved, that just doesn't disappear.
No, of course not, but...
And there's no further information on him.
That I can find as of now, no.
So I would assume, and I could be totally wrong, but I think this is one of those cases, which again, we have talked about before, where people come forward and they give information, totally not knowing anything about the case, just because they want to be involved.
Yeah.
This could be a guy that was incorrect in his thinking, that was not mentally stable and came forward with this story. There are a slew of other options that are available that could rule this guy out, opposed to him feeling guilty and wanting to give some type of story to investigators, but not the real story, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I still think that it's possible that he may have seen them, even if the rest of the story isn't true. Because how is it that no one ever saw this couple again after they got out of this truck driver's truck and then they were literally never seen again? And this truck driver was vetted. It seems like he's legit. So someone else had to have seen them. So maybe at the end of the day, maybe Alan just saw them and he's weaving this weird story because he's a weirdo. Regardless of if you believe that Alan Smith saw them or not, I think at the end of the day, because the information is out there, I think it's important that we talk about this big thing that I want to mention, and that's specifically about the guy that may have been driving the VW bus. Because it's been reported everywhere that this guy has never been found. No one knows who he is. They don't know anything like that. So yes, it could go along John's line of thinking, where he thinks that maybe this story isn't true in any way, shape, or form, or maybe because this case happened almost 50 years ago now, that it was just impossible to track this guy down. But I think at the end of the day, if you knew someone, or if you are someone who had an orange VW bus with Pennsylvania license plates back in 1973, that you should probably come forward. And if that guy exists, then I think that could help figure out what the fuck is going on here with this story.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, it would help either add credit to this story or just totally remove it from the table as far as like an option.
Yeah.
Orange VW Bug with Pennsylvania license plates is probably a small pool of people to pick from back in 73, 74, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they obviously they weren't looking for it back in the 70s. It was, early 2000s once they're working on this case again. But I'm sure you can still go back and look at those records just as easily to try and find anyone.
Records.
Yeah.
But also if somebody was that person, somebody listening or whatever.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yep. So it's like maybe this guy's story is a crock of shit and no one will ever come forward and say, oh, there was this orange VW bus that I drove and I remember picking up hitchhikers to go to or come back from Watkins Glen or,
Right. I mean, Alan Smith very well could have hitchhiked, gotten into this van with this person or the driver and any other people that were hitchhiking along with him. But the whole portion about
the drowning,
Bonnie and Mitchell could be a fabrication.
Yeah, exactly. But there was one other thing that I just wanted to mention about this 48 hours proposal and what was written in it regarding Alan Smith and his story and all of that. It states, quote, "They never notified police of the accident or tried to get help. Smith and the driver parted ways at the turnoff to Pennsylvania where the bus was headed. Investigators Stryver and Kilgallen felt this was a plausible story. Stryver was not totally convinced. He felt that Smith gave conflicting information and to this day shows no remorse about reporting it. He shrugs off any attempt to discuss guilt," end quote. So this whole part about, one of the detectives not being convinced, but then them also thinking maybe it's somewhat plausible. I don't know. I feel like maybe there's more, John, that you're not getting from this because, you've never talked to this guy. Maybe he's giving off vibes that the cops are like, maybe this is legit. Maybe he gave information that wasn't out in the world and that made them feel it was plausible, but then there's other aspects to it where they're like, you're kind of giving contradicting information or your story doesn't really make sense in this way, so.
Yeah, I don't know. I would need, pertinent information describing these kids, things that other people wouldn't know, things that hadn't been reported in the media beforehand.
Yeah.
In order to really be like, okay, maybe he actually did see these kids and actually did travel with them. I don't know. Did Bonnie know how to swim? Would she have gotten into a running river?
Well, it's interesting that you just started saying that because the next thing I wanted to talk about was something that actually came up a lot on forums, specifically web sleuths and Reddit on this case, and it has to do with the rivers around this time of year, and specifically how high they may have been or what the current would have actually been like. And I feel like this is something that I feel like we're just calling out, or at least I am, calling out to our audience in this case, but this is something that I would like to know a lot more about and to hear from someone with expertise in this field. But there was this person on Reddit with the username Want to Play Ball, and it was mentioned in a thread regarding Mitchell and Bonnie's case that the rivers were apparently lower that year and that even if the two had drowned, their bodies would have most likely been found. And others have commented on this as well and made mention that the waters wouldn't have been all that strong, like the current wouldn't have taken them that far at this time of year. So it seems like based on what Alan Smith said, the couple was supposedly having a hard time in the water, but if what I'm talking about now is true, then first of all, how were they even, taken down by the current, and why were their bodies not located?
And why can nobody assist them?
Yeah, that doesn't add up.
Yeah, which is probably some of the contradicting information that police had against him. It's like, you're telling this story, but based on what we know about this river, that doesn't seem like it would have been the case.
Yeah, maybe that is one of the pieces of contradictory information. I'm just curious, though. It's like, I'm no good with nature. I'll put that out there. Same thing with last week's case on Louis Chaput. I was trying to figure out hiking and all these trails and all this stuff. I feel like when it comes to nature, I'm no good with it. So I really would like to hear from anybody that would know or would know what to look for, or certain websites to search for, I don't know, different rivers and what their currents were like. Do they keep records of that kind of stuff? I would think so.
I mean, there are groups of people that document so many different types of things, so I'm sure there's something out there, but probably a small niche.
This is true.
That you may have to really dig for.
All right, so as we continue on with the story, I do just want to go back yet again to the MSNBC segment I've mentioned a bazillion times in this episode, but one big thing about this episode had to do with, you guessed it, the other psychic. Now, this guy is different from the first, like I mentioned earlier on, and I don't believe they were ever the same person because it seems as though this man, his name is Maurice Schickler, And he came forward after Eric Greenburg had published his article in the Jewish Week. I guess that's what prompted him to come forward and say he wanted to help. So he's actually interviewed by MSNBC, and he claims he needed to find this rock quarry with a cemetery nearby to find where he believed Bonnie and Mitchell may have been killed. And then there's all this other stuff. And you know what? I'm actually going to have you listen to him directly and what he has to say in this interview.
Eric's article caught the interest of psychic Maurice Schickler. Bonnie and Mitchell's families agreed to let Schickler help with the case. First, he visited the camp. Then he set about finding a site that matched the visions he had received about the case.
My information told me that I had to find a rock quarry. Also, the information said that there was a cemetery in the neighborhood or in the area of the quarry that I had to find. Also, two numbers came up. One was 23 and the other was 34. And as I left Camp Wilmette, I noticed in my rearview mirror that I was on Route 23.
After several hours, Maurice found the area he was looking for in a neighboring town.
But this is the place, and I believe that the murder took place up on the hill. And there's a road that goes up this hill to the quarry off on the right side.
Maurice believes Bonnie and Mitchell were murdered.
Mitchell was murdered by a man who was a veteran, a Vietnam War veteran. The murderer grabbed him and put his hand over his nose and his mouth and squeezed his throat. He then murdered Bonnie in another location several days later, I believe.
Recently, Maurice has said he believes the man's name is Wayne, Wade, or Willie, and that he is still alive. Though there is no evidence to support his claims, the families feel Maurice's theory is worth further investigation.
Now, it was mentioned in this video that the family did believe they should look further into the psychic's information on the case, but I did also see something stated in the 48 hours proposal I found that I thought was interesting, to say the least. Do you want me to read it to you first before you give me thoughts?
Go for it.
It states, quote, "After Eric Greenburg meets with him, the psychic comes to my house. I was creeped out. I had a wild feeling. Maybe this man is the murderer. He was kind of describing himself," end quote. Again, I'm not sure who it was that wrote this. I'm only assuming it's a sibling of Mitchell's, but I don't know if they hold the same sentiment today about this psychic, but I just thought that was a really interesting comment about this guy.
Yeah, I don't know. This guy comes off like a quack.
He comes off to me like the type that is, first of all, giving way too much detail, way too much information, and is enjoying being interviewed for this.
Yeah.
For the fame, for the recognition. But I think I don't know. I think all of the things that...
Is this guy an established psychic? Or did he just come out of the woodwork and say, I'm a psychic and I have this information?
I'm not sure, honestly. I don't know if he's still around today.
I doubt it. I mean, he looked pretty old here.
Yeah, 22 years ago. So, but either way, I think he is, first of all, like I said, he's giving too much information. He's very detailed, which is kind of morbid to...
Right, about how Mitchell was killed, like his mouth and nose suffocated.
Yeah.
And then strangled, and then Bonita a couple days later in another location.
Yeah, like all this stuff, and this to me is too convenient compared to Alan Smith's story. Like, this just feels like he's trying to give every possible answer and, button up the case neat and tidy with his visions, and it doesn't seem like anything ever panned out. I mean, it's 22 years later, we still don't know where Mitchell and Bonnie are. So I just think, I don't know, I don't believe a freaking word this guy says.
Yeah, I don't necessarily either.
But I can, see why the family would be like, we should look into this. Of course. If it were me, if it were my kid, if it were my loved one, I would be like, let's look into it, even though this seems crazy.
Yeah, and I would hope that authorities would have, dug into this guy's background a little bit too, because it is strange. Generally with psychics, you would assume that they would have more generalized ideas that can't be, struck down so easily. But when you're going into specifics of locations and means of the murder and MO and stuff like that, like, how do you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, where did you get that from?
Right.
your
Is
vision.
it just a feeling or a vision?
Yeah, it's just weird. But moving on from the psychic, one of the best things that came from this MSNBC segment was that there was some renewed hope, at least for me anyway, that this case may not be completely unsolvable. And that's because Mitchel's sister had found a hairbrush as well as Mitchel's baby teeth that could be potentially used to help identify him if his body were to ever be found. So even though authorities might have screwed up and lost those dental records, destroyed them, who knows where they are, now they might have something else that they could use in case they needed it in the future. Now, after this big flurry in the media in the late 90s, early 2000s, there really hasn't been a ton of additional coverage on the case. However, there are a few tidbits of information about the current investigation that I've seen mentioned. First of all, in 2021, it was reported that the year prior, so 2020, there had been a lead in the case that brought them to upstate New York. I guess authorities had received some type of information or a tip that stated the couple was buried in a yard in upstate New York. The Democrat and Chronicle reported, quote, "We jackhammered someone's stairs. We had to replace them. They found nothing conclusive," end quote. Even though nothing was found, it's still promising that Mitchel and Bonnie's case is being worked on so recently, and leads are taking authorities to places to search, because honestly, I really don't think there ever was a search done in this case. And if there were, the public wasn't made aware of them. But one not so great aspect to this case, and just another of the reasons that I really hope it might get resolved, is that this is considered one of, if not the oldest, missing teens case in the entire United States.
I'm surprised at that.
Really?
We're talking, what, 73 or is it 74?
73.
So 73, that's the oldest missing teen?
Where you haven't found a body.
Yeah, I mean,
you know?
Oldest recorded. Because I'm sure there are plenty that have
that's true.
gone unrecorded, but still, you'd think that would bring extra attention to the case.
Yeah, I'm just
to
so
say
surprised.
We finally solved or located the bodies of the oldest missing teens case in the entire country. I'm surprised by that.
I was surprised by it too, and I was looking through, I'm like, is it actually? I saw that it was the second oldest in Sullivan County for some time, which we know that was the initial PD on the case. But it seems like based on other bigger publications and research that was done, I think it is the oldest missing teens case in the U.S. And if I'm wrong, please, somebody let me know which one is. But I just think this would be one of those cases that you would see more about, people talking more about. Don't get me wrong, the web sleuths and Redditors of the world are definitely all over this case. There were 15 pages of discussion on web sleuths alone. So people are interested, but it's just so interesting to me that the media isn't putting more out, that people aren't putting pressure on the PDs again to say hey, you're 50 years.
Right. You think that when it comes to media exposure and focus of a department and things like that, or police department, I should say, you have your oldest and your newest.
Yeah.
Always at the forefront of what people are interested in.
Yeah.
So I find it strange or a little odd that more resources and more media coverage hasn't been brought to this potentially oldest case, not only in New York for missing teens, but in the entire country. That's a huge thing to be able to solve, to say, hey, back in 73, these two kids went missing at this time, and we finally found them. We finally were able to lay them to rest. It's just weird that there's not more info and research being put into it.
Yeah, I agree. Now, before we dive into theories and questions we're left with, I want to discuss something that Mitchel's best friend had mentioned, and that's in regards to looking through old pictures from Watkins Glen and the Summer Jam concert. A big part of this case is the fact that it's unclear if Mitchel and Bonnie ever actually made it to Summer Jam. No one has ever come forward to say that they were seen there, and the only thing that might lead you to believe that they did make it was that comment Alan Smith made saying they hitchhiked together after the concert. But if you don't believe his story, it's still totally up in the air if they actually made it to Watkins Glen. The big thing that this friend of Mitchel's mentioned was that if there were photos of them out there that could place them at Summer Jam on July 28th, 1973, it could help with the investigation and better nailing down the timeline. As of now, there's not much outside of that last confirmed sighting by the truck driver. There are actually a bunch of photos of Summer Jam at Watkins Glen on the Mitchell and Bonnie website. Well, actually, there's like a link to another site to get to it, but you can access them all through there. I am sure you could get lost for hours scouring these photos to see if Mitchell or Bonnie are in them. But I mean, it's worth a shot. I think a lot of people probably already have, but I really wanted to mention this because there could be listeners out there who have photos from that time who were at Summer Jam, or maybe their family member was at Summer Jam and those pictures were passed down to them. And maybe those individuals had brought a camera and they have photos in their home that were never posted online anywhere. So if you attended or knew somebody that attended Summer Jam in Watkins Glen, New York on July 28th, 1973, check your photos. Look through them. See if you can see Bonnie and Mitchell in them. So with that, John, I wanted to dive into theories. There are a few. I feel like we've gone over one big one, and that is, did they run away?
I don't know. This is one of those cases where I have no idea.
I know, me too.
I can't lean one way or another on this. I would hope that, obviously, if you think best case scenario, that these two are somewhere in a safe place, living a life together, that they're happy. Unfortunately, their family was left not knowing anything.
Yeah.
So the chances of that are slim.
Yeah, I just think based on everything everyone said about them, how close they were with their family, Bonnie and, you know, her relationship with her dad and how upset she was about how he was sick and all these other things, even if they wanted to leave for a short time, something that's been talked about is that maybe they wanted to leave until they were adults, like of legal age, and then come back so that they could have that independence and that freedom, kind of like how Bonnie had mentioned in that letter. But I don't know. I just think that at the very least they would have come back then, or at least in 2000 where there was tons of publicity.
I don't know. I think publicity can go either way with that, because the more, like if you've been in hiding, and the more that it's out in the media and stuff, like that's a spotlight that's being brought onto you that you may not want to have to deal with. Because if you come back and you're like, oh, hey, here's where I've been.
Yeah.
This is the story. Now you have to answer to everyone's questions.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think at the end of the day that they would have come back.
Yeah, I think foul play is definitely a possibility here.
Yeah. So that's...
They were traveling over 100 miles, hoping to hitchhike. They didn't have a lot of money on them.
It makes me think of Simone Ridinger.
Yeah.
Like how she was traveling so far and everyone was concerned about the distance.
She wasn't traveling nearly as far, though.
No, I think it was half the amount of mileage.
Right.
So that brings us to the next theory then, which is, could they have been victims of foul play? And more specifically, a serial killer, which I feel like, yet again, this has been like a common thing that we've talked about a lot.
I feel like it's being brought in every case that we cover now.
Yeah, well, a serial killer out of Maryland supposedly had confessed at one point to killing Mitchell and Bonnie, and this was back in 2001. From what I can tell, the guy's totally freaking nuts, and I don't think there was really much that tied him or that could tie him to their case. I think authorities did have some semblance of a timeline and like where he was around, you know, certain times, but outside of him potentially being in the area where they were when they went missing, I don't think there's anything else that's ever tied him to it.
Or having information that he would only have.
Yes, exactly.
That he could give authorities that, you know, nobody else really knew.
Yeah, and again, this confession was supposedly in 2001, so you have to think 21 years later, you probably would have heard by now if this guy did it or not. And I don't even know his name, honestly. There was like some random like half cut off picture of him in the MSNBC segment and in like this 48 Hours proposal. There's no name listed for him. So clearly it doesn't seem like this guy was involved, but I don't think we can discount the fact of a serial killer, especially when you're considering how many people were unfortunately murdered back in this day and age while hitchhiking.
Is there a particular serial killer that you have
No.
in mind? No. Yeah, I think that, I mean, with true crime and murder and mystery and missing persons and all these investigations, I think the term serial killer gets thrown around a lot more than it should. You also have just bad fucking people, just killers that are also prowling the areas.
So that was what I was going to say next. Was this a person who picked them up and they had never killed before, maybe never killed again, but took this opportunity in the moment to do this horrific thing?
Yeah.
And it was just, I mean, I've heard of that before, like a person who killed one time and never did it again, someone who never had a violent past and something like this happened. Yep. Maybe that was the scenario.
I think that's more likely than a serial killer.
Especially considering there's 2 people.
Yeah, you have 2 people. I mean, they're both juveniles. They're not like, Mitchell was what, 5'7", 140-something pounds?
Yeah.
So he's not like, what is he going to do against a 6 foot, 200-something pound guy?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I don't know. Unfortunately, in this case, I feel as though something bad has happened to them and they were either murdered or they died. Potentially, who knows? Maybe in Alan Smith's story, they drowned in the river after the current had taken them away.
It's like you're following right along because that is the next theory here. Was this an accident?
Yeah, it could have been. I think
maybe Alan's story is not true at all, and it could be an accident some way, shape, or form,
or it's like
another way.
Or it's like what we say often where a story has some truth to it.
Yes. Well, that's what I was saying before when you were saying it's not like his story is convenient and there's not a lot to, tie him to this or to make this story seem believable. But I think there could be this small semblance of truth, and then he kind of spiraled out from there because maybe, like you said, maybe he was mentally unstable, all these other things. So.
Yeah. I don't know. It could be there's not enough out there. There's not enough information released or facts of the case that have been put out to the public to really make me say anything other than, unfortunately, I believe these 2 are deceased at this time, but the means of which they died is really up in the air. I've come to the conclusion that I don't believe that they ran away. Obviously, in Bonnie's letter, she loved her parents. She loved her family. Why would you just up and leave it over, just wanting some freedom? You wouldn't. Eventually, you would call them. You would contact them somehow. Is there the possibility that they were, being held captive on a reservation?
In a cult?
In a cult? Maybe. But I think that there are so many opportunities to run away from places or to escape, especially when it's 2 people, that the general conclusion that you have to come to is that they're no longer alive.
That's the conclusion I've come to as well. I don't know if it was foul play or if it was an accident. I think both are absolutely plausible. I agree with you on that. I don't think any of what the psychic said is true. I think, if anything, Alan Smith might have a tiny inkling to do with this, but not in any way, like, involved in their murder. I think, again, that's something we would have found out by now.
Yeah, who knows about the whole psychic thing? I mean, there's no diploma you get for going to psychic school to show that you're an accredited psychic. So anybody can come forward and say, oh, I had a vision and this is what happened. So it's like, I think, our problem where you have to take all that with a grain of salt. So could the psychic have been the person that was involved, or could he have had more knowledge on things than what he had led on to? And did Stuart, Mitchell's friend from the time before he disappeared, was he kind of on the right track that maybe this guy knew something because of some type of involvement that he had in their disappearance or murder? I don't know what I think.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly where I've come to the
I just don't think that they ran
on.
away.
Yeah, I agree. Even though there were all these other things in the beginning to say, totally possible, this would make sense, this would make sense, this is what everyone believed in the beginning.
Right.
Now.
I think what has to happen is people that went to Summer Jam at the time, those are the people that need to hear about this story, that need to come forward. Hey, did you take pictures at the time? Did you see people there that matched this description? And if nobody ever did, then maybe they never got there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a plausible idea as well. So now that we worked through the theories, we'll move on to the questions we're left with. The first thing that I had and that I want to know more about, which I already mentioned, was about the rivers, the current at the time back then. If any of Alan Smith's story is accurate, why were Bonnie and Mitchell's bodies never found? What were the rivers like? Is this accurate that it would have been lower and a less aggressive current? So then you can kind of discount his story that way.
Yeah, the question I was left with was, we know we have Mitchell's hair and baby teeth. So is there any type of testing going on where DNA was taken from those articles, entered into a system, and now they can go through and they can search all the John Does?
Yeah, I would love to know
to see if there's any type of matching there. Were those items ever put into a database?
Yeah, very good question. Another one I had was regarding Bonnie and her job was, did she quit because she was actually angry about not being able to go, or did she have this plan to quit in the first place if she, wasn't allowed to go and she would have been like, well, I'm going to do it anyway? And was it a part of like a plan to up and leave? Which, I mean, I don't think we've come to the conclusion that she up and left, but I think it's still something to ask.
She may have, but things could have went awry
yes,
after that.
Yeah, that's definitely possible.
And then my other question was, where did this truck driver, who is like the last
confirmed
sighting, where did he drop them off? And then if he dropped them off in like a center or like a city location or anywhere besides the side of the road, did anyone ever see these kids in that area and see who they got into a vehicle with from that location?
Yeah, good question. That was all I had. I mean, I had probably a bazillion others, but I think we've kind of rehashed them a lot throughout this episode. But
yeah, the only other thing would be the portion of people that went to Summer Jam, pictures that they had taken. Did anybody ever see these kids?
Mitchel and Bonnie's families have suffered without answers for far too long. Someone out there knows what happened all those years ago, and after almost 50 years, I think it's finally time you come forward. If you have any information about where Mitchel Weiser or Bonnie Bickwit might be or what happened to them, please contact the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office at 845-807-0732. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.